All right, so there's a couple things you can do to get people to come to stuff. Like a lot of times it's the titles of stuff. So if I said I was going to talk about demons, people would like the room would be like packed. Spiritual combat is pretty close. Until now, I give kind of let you guys down a little bit and let you know what it's really about. Yeah, totally clickbait. This is ultimately, I mean, we're going to talk about like battling demons, but it's focused across the spectrum of all three of our enemies: the devil, the flesh, and the world. And what I did was use the book Spiritual Combat, which I know at least one of you have read. Has anyone else ever even seen that book? Right, so it is, it's an old book. It was written in like the 1530s. Yeah, except that, and I promise there's probably at least one copy on that shelf over there if I had to guess. But it was when saints start recommending books, like those are the books you should read. St. Francis de Sales used to call Spiritual Combat his spiritual director. So he'd carry around a little pocket in his pocket, the book, and he would read it once a month, go all the way through it. St. John Henry Newman, same way. In fact, when he converted from Anglicanism to Catholicism, part of Anglicanism to Catholicism, yes. Well, there are, plenty of isms, but that's not one of them, I don't think. He kind of attributed that, yeah, there it is. Attributed that to this book, was one of the reasons. All right, and so what it's mostly about is about developing good spiritual habits to replace the bad ones. Right, and that's why I think you guys will get a lot out of it. I'm not going to go through the whole book because the book is long. I'm only going to meet for 5 weeks, but what I want to do is go over his principles, and then sort of his there's like a 4-prong attack. We'll talk about in a second. The language of it is a little bit, I'm going to say outdated, but it's a little hard to read because we have sort of stopped using some of the terms that he uses. Asceticism. What's asceticism? Anyone know what asceticism is?
Is it like to become apathetic?
That might be part of it, right? So you say apathetic in the sense of like indifferent to whatever God wants when you say apathetic, right? That would be part of it.
Kind of about simplicity and austerity.
Yeah, that would also be part of it. So simplicity, austerity, holy indifference is what you're talking about. Yes.
I think I Googled the right word, but we're not sure.
Okay.
Severe and avoidance of all forms of indulgence, typically for religious.
So rule number 2, just so maybe you guys like, I'm giving you presentation advice as well. Always have clickbait for a title and never use Google to define a term. Which and corollary A to that is don't use like Merriam-Webster either. Like if you start a talk going, Merriam-Webster says defines blah blah as this, and then you set out to then define it a totally different way. All right, so what I want to do is give you a definition for asceticism, if I can get the keyboard to respond to it. All right, in its most general sense, asceticism can be said to represent all those elements of the spiritual life that involve an organized campaign against the sinful aspects of the self and against exterior temptation, as well as positive efforts directed toward the perfection of our spiritual activities. All right, what I want to emphasize this, so our examples, you guys gave examples and those are part of them. What I want to kind of help you do over the next few weeks is the terms in italics: organized campaign against the sinful aspects of the self. How many of you think your spiritual life is organized? Yeah, I mean, most people would say, yeah, kind of not, right? What I want to do is help you get essentially develop an organized campaign against those enemies. That's spiritual combat, right? So invoking our reason to come up with a plan of life to attack our faults. All right, and that's mainly what we're going to aim at, because all the other weapons, the world, the spirit of the world, and the devil, always gain access to us through our faults, right? So the caveat, which I think when we talked last semester, I said the same thing. Like when you discover faults, right, that's a good thing. Right? Don't fear doing that, because those are the areas where Jesus wants to heal you, right? And so when you discover a fault, you go to Jesus and ask him to heal it, right? He won't do it without you asking, right? Because why does he do that? Why does he require us to ask? Anyone know?
He's more concerned about our asking than actual healing.
Well, I mean, the asking part so that we understand like where the gift came from, for sure. Yes,
Humility.
so humility is an important aspect of it. Yes, Megan.
What if we don't want to be healed though? Like there has to be some kind of voluntary sense of choosing to be healed.
Yes, I mean, for sure. There, you think about like the lepers, right? He goes, "What do you want?" Well, I want to be healed.
Yeah, and I guess like there's that aspect of it, but also too like if you're not like bringing it to the like, because like I know personally, like if I find a fault in myself, sometimes I spend a lot of like time wastefully searching for another way to heal it before I take it to the Lord. So like even if you know something needs to be healed, that doesn't mean it's going to take it to God first.
Right. Right. Well, and the other part, which I don't want you to take away from us meeting and talking about this, is like, oh, the things I just got to try harder. Right. Like that's not what I'm saying at all. Like trying harder is good. That's a good thing. But that's not the end, like the end all and be all. Because ultimately, this is, Christianity is not about self-help, right? The key, though, why Jesus wants us to go to him and ask is because he wants us to be vulnerable to him, right? He wants us to open up, because only in that place of vulnerability can you even begin to trust God. When you go to him and you're just brutally honest, you're like, you know what? I hate this thing about myself. I've tried every possible way to stop doing it. And just lay yourself bare and you just say, like, do your thing, Jesus, right? And that's exactly what he wants, because that's where intimacy happens, right? You're letting him into the place in your heart, into your heart where no one else goes. All right. And so what we're going to do is we're going to find ways to sort of get ideas of where our faults are, how to root them out, and that sort of have a positive way of looking at them. All right. So let's look at an understanding again, like this is meant to be practical. Like this hopefully will change the way you pray, and it will hopefully change the way you your relationship with Jesus. Okay. Otherwise, if we don't have this sort of organized campaign, we just do things generically and we're jumping all over the place, right? And what this is kind of offering us is, combat in the truest sense of like an ordered attack against sin and our faults. Okay. All right. So let's look at the sort of the outline of what we're going to do. And this is basically the whole first half of his book. Okay. So today we're going to talk about his first principles. And these are principles by which everything is built upon, thus these first principles, but that we need to be kind of examining ourselves against. All right. And then each of the next 4 weeks, we'll look at the 4 weapons that he has: humility and self-distrust. The second is the virtue of hope and confidence in God. The third is the longest of the group, and it's just a set of spiritual exercises. And then the fourth is the practice of prayer. All right. Okay. All right.
Is there any specific order?
Yeah, they kind of are. When we look at the first principles, you'll see that they sort of build on each other. In a certain sense, like humility is almost the beginning of the spiritual life, right? And that self-distrust. But you'll see once we do the first principles why they kind of built that way. All right, so here's his first principles, and what we'll do the rest of tonight is basically unpack these and discuss them. Okay. First, the knowledge of the goodness and the greatness of God and our nothingness and our inclination to all evil. I'll talk about each one of these in detail in a minute. The love of him and the hatred of ourselves. And you can see immediately the language, right? Like that the love of him and the hatred of ourselves, the idea of hating yourself. The pop psychologists of the day would have a field day with that, right? So I want to sort of get us to have a healthy hatred of ourselves. Subjection, not to him alone, but for love of him to all his creatures. The entire renunciation of all will of our own, and an absolute resignation to all his divine pleasure. And then fifth, willing and doing all this purely for the glory of God and solely to please him, and because he so wills and merits thus to be loved and to be served. All right. So what's the end goal of these? Like, why do we need them? What are they first principles ordered? Like, what are they first principles of, or what are they for?
To glorify God.
Okay, for sure, right? What are the two things? Why did God create? The two reasons God creates. Yeah, so for the glory of God and the salvation of souls, right? The glory and starting first with your own. Okay. All right. So what I want to do though is back up just a little step and then just talk about from the very beginning of the book why we're doing this. All right. So Lorenzo Scupoli is the author. Says, Christian soul, if you seek to reach the loftiest peak of perfection and to unite yourself so intimately with God that you become one with spirit with him, you must first know the true nature and perfection of spirituality in order to succeed in the most sublime undertaking that can be experienced or imagined. What does he mean by perfection? Say that again. Say it again.
Like the goal to which we're seeking in spiritual life, like the end.
Well, yeah. So why though? Why do we want to be perfect?
God can't be anything that's not perfect. Like our goal, and he says it in there, is like this like union with God.
Yeah. So the goal is union with God,
So, like,
right? So perfection is just simply a means, right? And the minute we take it, like really a lot of the mistakes we make, I mean, in life in general, but in the spiritual life, is treating means as ends, right? Perfection is just so that I can get closer to God. So that every impediment that's in the way of me doing that is gone. Right. And so that's the whole reason, right? So the whole purpose of spiritual combat, as fun as it is not so that I become perfect. The whole purpose of spiritual combat is so that I can be closer to God. Right, so that I can be opened up. And so we should never treat perfection or holiness as an end in itself. And there's a simple reason for that, right? The reason for that is if you do that, you will always be self-satisfied because you'll always think, well, I'm holy. It's good, right? But knowing you can get close, this is why I said the thing about vulnerability. I almost did it again. I said the thing of the Italian coming out, the thing about vulnerability with Christ, right? Because that opens up an intimate relationship. And that's what this is totally about, is that intimate relationship, not about becoming, this perfect person. And so it's always a mean for deepening our relationship with Christ. And it means we can always do better, right? We can always do better. We can open ourselves more. We can go deeper. And it always unites us closer and closer to Christ. All right. I'm scared of anything. The balancing act. Okay. All right. So let's go to his first one. So the knowledge of the goodness and greatness of God and our nothingness and inclination to all evil. All right. So first I want to talk about the knowledge of the goodness and the greatness of God. All right. So this is going to seem totally random, but the direction I want to come at this from. But I want you to begin to think about this. All right, so what I have up there is a quote from 1 Kings chapter 19. You guys know the story. Jezebel is threatening Elijah. Elijah goes running off to get away from her. goes into the mountains, and God says that he's going to come and talk to him. Right? He's going to come meet him. And there he came to a cave. This is Elijah, and lodged there. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And he says, "I've been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the people of Israel have forsaken thy covenant, thrown down thy altars, and slain thy prophets with the sword. And I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away." And he said, "Go forth and stand upon the mount before the Lord." And behold, the Lord passed by. All right. And you guys know that. So first, there's a strong wind, then there's an earthquake. And God's not in those things, right? But he's in, and then there's a fire. He's not in the fire. And then here's a small, still voice, right? And Elijah hides his face, right? Why the small, still voice? Because admittedly, like Moses, how did God come to Moses? The fire, right? Right? Earthquakes. Like you would expect powerful God to come in earthquakes. Sort of. I mean, even the fact that he's talking, but even a humble God coming in an earthquake is still pretty awesome.
Yeah, but it's not about awesome. It's like
No, I mean the point of, yeah, go ahead, finish.
no, go ahead.
No, I was just saying that he's still like lowering himself to come, even if it's just in an earthquake.
But like this to like me like represents like, oh, like you should always like look for him when are we gonna like find ourselves like with God in the silence whenever we can actually examine ourselves and like focus on that and like find out, like root out these things and find him.
Okay, so God's primary language is silence. That is true. But what I want to focus on is Elijah heard God because he knew what he sounded like. And he knew what he sounded like, not because he came in that small, still voice, but because he always came in the small, still voice to Elijah. Right? So what the first step in this whole journey, right? Like knowledge of God is not knowledge about God. Right? Elijah has this relationship and he recognizes God's voice among any other voice. All the voices in his head, he knows it's God's voice. Right? All the things going around, God has a language that he speaks to each one of us individually, and it's totally unique. Right? It's totally unique. How many of you know the voice of God when you hear it? Good. You know, it's a very specific voice. Like I know when God is speaking to me, the voice is very direct and very matter of fact. And I know that's God. Okay, and that I can't explain it to you, but I know it. And so some of you raised your hand, but those of you who didn't, you will know the voice, what God sounds like when he talks to you individually, and he has a unique way of speaking to you. All right. Because that's what he wants. So my point is, like, there's revelation, right? Like the Bible, nature, everything. And then there's personal revelation where God comes to me and speaks directly to me, right? And we want to move from revelation to personal revelation, right? And I want to learn how God speaks to me. And how do you learn how God speaks to you? Listen and ask. Yeah, ask, right? So many times we're just like, I mean, I think about this when I'm like spiritual direction. I'm like, they're like, well, I really want to do this. Well, did you ask Jesus? No, like we don't ask Jesus, right? Ask Jesus, right? I want to know what your voice sounds like. Tell me. He's not mysterious and he's not trying to hide from us, right? Just, I need to, of all the voices I hear coming at me once, I need to know which voice is yours. And he will tell you. He will tell you every single time. Right? So Elijah was in tune. He knew what God sounded like and he was just waiting for it. And the earthquake, the fire, none of that could distract him. Right? None of it could distract him because he was listening for God's voice the way God spoke to him. All right. So one of the ways that God speaks to us, and this now goes back to what Scupoli is saying about the goodness and the greatness of God, is through his providence. All right. All right. So what is providence, right? What well, the word has provide in it, right? It's the way that God provides us with everything we need. All right. We tend to think providence like, I don't know, like I always think of like, I don't know, like the founding fathers, like they always talked about providence, right? But it was providence in this big, broad thing of like, oh, like providentially the fog rolled in. And it's just like as if God has this plan for the universe and it just keeps going. And it's a perfect plan. But that's not what providence is. Providence is God's plan for the universe as if you are the only one in it. All right. God's plan for the universe is if you are the only one in it. It is the means by which he provides you with everything you need. All right. And so think about that for a second. Right? Think about that for a second. Is there any time of the day where God is not acting in your life? No, right? Not a single time. Like, so again, if it really is like God's plan for the universe is if I'm the only one in it, everything that happens is ordered to my good. Everything that happens is he did it specifically for me as if I was the only one who ever existed. Like, think about that for a second, right? And one of the things like we have to be able to do to move from like public, we'll call it public revelation to self-revelation, is to take scripture literally, right? Romans chapter 9, verse 6, all things work for good for those who love God. Not some things, not sometimes, not all things. At every single moment throughout the day, God is coming to you and offering you something that ultimately will bring you closer to him, right? And we just have to say yes. All we have to do is say yes. All right. So it's not how he manages the universe. It's how he manages my salvation. That's providence. All right. What's the like I said that and I made it sound so simple, right? Like, here's the problem though, is that fundamentally we're suspicious, right? It's hardwired into us, right? So what I want to do is like go through the fall and look at what the devil was ultimately trying to do. All right. Now the serpent was more subtle than any other wild creature that the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, did God say you shall not eat of any tree of the garden? And the woman said to the serpent, we may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but God said, you shall not eat of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden. Neither shall you touch it, lest you die. What is he trying to do? What is the devil trying to do? Ultimately, cast out on what?
The honest relationship we have with God.
Yeah. So he's trying to cast out on the fact that God is your father. Ultimately, what he's saying, like, God's holding out on you. God is holding out on you. Like, he won't let you have fruit from this tree. He's holding out on you. Is he really your father? Right. That's why John Paul II says that original sin is ultimately rejection of God's fatherhood. And so from that moment on, mankind is always suspicious of God. Right. What we have to do is flip the suspicion and make us suspicious of ourselves. That's what he wants us to do. That my interpretation is wrong if it ever points me away from God's fatherhood. Right? Anything that points away from God's fatherhood, I've got to reinterpret the data. I got to look at it again. But that has to be the lens from which we look at everything, right? Because ultimately, like that's our identity, right? That's who we are. We are sons and daughters of God. All right. And so when Scupoli talks about focusing on our nothingness and our inclination to evil, that's what he means, right? Not that we like keep examining ourselves, like that we have this total focus, but understand that anything that draws me away from seeing God as my father, I've misinterpreted. All right, does that make sense? All right, what about this nothingness? Right, nothingness is a sort of hard thing for us to grasp a little bit. What is nothing? But what is a healthy way to do what he's doing? All right, to do what he's suggesting about focusing on our nothingness. Saint Catherine of Siena, who hopefully you all know, she has a dialogue that God had her write. It's a conversation between her and God the Father. And God the Father comes to her and says, "Do you know, daughter, who you are and who I am?" And he says, "If you know these two things, you will be blessed. You are she who is not, whereas I am he who is." All right. So what does that mean? What does that mean? What is a healthy way to sort of understand our nothingness? Because we have to sit with it because it's a foundational principle, but we certainly don't need to wallow in it. Why do you exist? Why? Don't anybody raise their hand, please tell me. I don't really need to know why that is. I actually know why one of you exists. Very detailed. I know why one of you exists. But that being said, the rest of you, I have no idea. And even that, I don't know.
All
No.
those on Zoom. Dominic is here. He's right. Unfortunately.
So how do we focus on this sort of utter nothingness of our existence, right? If we don't start there, this is the thing. I don't sit there and go forever and go, yeah, I'm just dirt, dust. I'm a fertilized egg, whatever you want to be. Like it could have been, the other sperm was faster that one day, whatever. Like I wouldn't even exist. But think about the fact that you don't need to exist, right? Like I know that maybe is a shock to some people, but you don't have to exist. Right? Does that bother anyone? I don't have to exist. It should bother us a little bit. But here's the question. And this is why we sit with it. Yet I still do. I don't need to exist, but I still do. Why? Because God thought the world was better with me in it than not. Right? So God sets to make creation, and he's like, creation is not going to be right unless Rob's in it. Creation is not going to be right unless Rob's in it. And that is in a certain sense, right? So this is why we will totally miss that point. The total gift of life and the total gift of existence. We will miss that point until we understand that we don't need to be here and that we're nothing. Right? The second part of it is that everything that's good in me came from him. Right? And we get platitudes like that all the time. But what I want to do is to draw a little deeper out of that, to understand that what that means, again, isn't that I should, beat myself up, but just that every good that I have is a gift from him. First and foremost to me. This is the part we miss, right? The gift, every good that I have, he gave it to me, right? As if it was my own. So he thinks the world is better because I'm in it. And he gives me certain gifts so that I can enjoy my existence. Right? I'll miss that if I think the gifts are mine. If I think it's all me striving harder and harder. So again, we're back to understanding nothingness. Third part, I have to understand actually the only thing I have that's my own is my sin. Right? That's the bad news. That's the bad news. The only thing that I can take ownership of that didn't come from God is my sin. The flip side of that, though, is that I have to understand that even my sins are part of his providence. Think about that for a second. He can stop me from sinning at any time. Why does he allow me to fall into the sins that I fell into? Because it's ultimately oriented for my good. Even my sins are for my good. Right? So fundamentally, I have to understand, first and foremost, I am capable of anything, and not in a good way. Right? Not in a good way at all. Right? Convince yourself of that. And if not, like spend some time with people and hear and listen to their stories, and you'll realize that you are capable of really bad things. Right? Circumstances different. I think I've shared this with you before. The most striking example I can ever think of this is a guy I met when I was doing ministry at Central Prison. And we used to do this exercise with them. Have I told you guys this story before? We used to do this exercise with them where we'd give them an index card and we'd say, okay, show me your life, like spiritual life, like where God has been in your life, right? And this guy, we hand him a card and he draws a line that's maybe like that long, right? It's a big card. And he makes it bottom out. And then he just draws a straight line across the bottom, you know? And I was like, oh boy, I was like, why'd I get matched up with this guy? This guy clearly doesn't want to do the exercise, you know? And so I said to him, I was like, hey, like, that's pretty like dark. Like what happened? Like, how old were you there? He's like, oh, I was 4. And I was like, oh, well, what happened? He's like, well, that's when I watched my mom and dad kill my little sister. I'm like sitting there and literally like the tears are coming out of my eyes. I'm like, oh, this guy never had a chance. I'm like, why am I not that guy? I could have been that guy. That situation, like, what else would he have been turned into, right? And this whole like, I mean, it like kind of put me in a little tailspin because I was sitting there, I was like, man, like, I can't offer this guy anything because like I have no experience of that. Like I would, and then I was like, I would turn out 1,000 times worse if that was me. Right? But from that, I understood that I was capable of anything and God kept me from many, many, many things. Understand that, right? And this is why things like a general confession, you guys know what a general confession is? A general confession is when you get a confession, usually in the midst of a retreat, you'll go and you'll confess all of your past sins. And it's meant to be just a way that you examine yourself to, usually it's during the spiritual exercises, examine yourself to see where God has brought you, where he's brought you over the course of your life. Right? And hopefully you'll see, oh yeah, like, well, not hopefully, but you know, in my own life, it's like, okay, those are really bad sins, and look how he's moved me. But that will give you an idea of the direction your life could have gone in had it not been for God jumping in. All right, so that's the healthy way to understand your nothingness. Right? It's not an attack on your self-esteem, it's just rooting you in truth. Okay. All right, so his second principle, all right, does that make sense? Okay. Second principle he talks about is hatred of self. All right, so let's talk about this and then we'll unpack the scripture passage, what this means and doesn't mean. There is a natural progression in our spiritual lives. And again, we can examine ourselves usually to know this. When we turn to God, normally the first step in the process is we love God, we love ourselves, we love ourselves more than we love God. Okay. Again, that's a normal progression. Still love God, it's still good. Then at some point that flips, right? And you begin to love God more than you love yourself. All right. So when he talks about hatred of self, that's what he means. All right. First. Second, I remember having a conversation, and this wasn't that long ago. And I was talking to someone about abortion, and I said they said something about like being opposed to abortion, and I said, well, I really hate abortion, and it was the first time I ever said that out loud. Like, I hate abortion, and I realized, wait, it was an idea, for me. And then suddenly something clicked and it got real and I hated it. Right. And I realized, well, actually, when you hate something, that's when you do something about it. Right. So until I hate the stuff I do, I'm not going to do anything about it. I'll make up excuses. I'll rationalize. I'll find ways to cope. All those things. But Jesus doesn't want you to have coping mechanisms. Right. Freedom has no coping mechanism. So you literally have to go to Jesus and say, I hate this about myself. I hate that I gossip. I hate that I whatever, right? Tell him you hate it. That's what this means. That vulnerability of just going to him, because vulnerability is like the gateway that opens the invasion of grace. Right? That's how it happens. The minute you're vulnerable, your heart is now open and grace comes in. Right? And that's where this gospel comes in. So this is the man with the withered hand. And he went on from there and entered their synagogue. And behold, there was a man with a withered hand. And they asked him, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? So that they might accuse him. He said to them, what man of you, if he has one sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not lay hold of it and lift it out? Of how much more value is a man than a sheep? So it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Then he said to the man, stretch out your hand. And the man stretched it out, and it was restored, whole like the other. Okay, two things. Where do you think the man's hand was? Hidden, right? Do you think he wanted to take his hand out? Probably not. Could he even stretch out his hand? Wasn't that the whole point? Right, like the whole point of like, it's withered, I can't stretch it out. Jesus tells him something he can't do, but he made himself vulnerable. And he hated his hand more than he loved his self-esteem. And so he did it. Right? That's what we have to do. All right. We have to hate the thing more than we love our pride. All right, so that's hatred of self. That's principle 2. All right, 3. So subjection, not to him alone, but for love of him to all his creatures. This just simply is at the end of Matthew's gospel, Matthew 25, when Jesus separates the sheep from the goats, he separates them based on the people who knew that love of him required them to love the same thing he loves. Love of him requires us to love the same things as he loves. And if we really begin to think that way, you will change the way you interact with him. Right? Those guys in central prison, like Jesus died for them too. When you become convinced of that, like there's no throwaways. As much as our culture wants us to think there are no throwaways. Do nothing from selfishness or conceit, but in humility count others better than yourselves. All right, so loving God in a certain way feels good, right? Like in our minds, but it's way harder when we actually put that love sort of in motion, right? So the affective dimension we like, the effective, not so much. Right? Because Dorothy Day said, I really only love God as much as as the person I love the least. Right? All right, so 4th principle, renouncing our will. That is a picture of St. Faustina's diary. So she went on a retreat in 1935. And so obviously you guys know the story of her diary. And one of the pages in the diary has a gigantic X across it. And underneath it, it just says, from now on, my own will does not exist. She crossed it out. The rest of the words on the page and the next page are Jesus's response to her. And he essentially gives her the courage to make that statement, right? That's not her doing it on her own, by the way, at all. She's a saint. That's Jesus giving her the courage to renounce her own will. And then he says, from today on, do not fear God's judgment, for you will not be judged. Why? Why won't you be judged? Think about this for a second. If you do God's will all the time, do you need to be judged? No, like it's a free pass, right? Like if I seek to do God's will all the time, there's nothing to judge. We are in simpatico, right? Like we are doing the same thing, right? Like this is the this is the story of saints in heaven, right? They're powerful intercessors because they're completely united to God's will. What does that look like? What does that look like? I mean, that's the question you have to take to prayer, right? Like, what does it look like? But the first thing you have to do is, do you really want that? Do you really want to give your will away? The answer probably is no. That's okay, because at least maybe you want that, or maybe want that. Again, that's you have to take it to prayer, and you have to ask Jesus to want it, and then give it away, because that's what He wants, and be absolutely convicted that that is the only path to happiness. The only path, right? God has, in His goodness, God the Father has given, has a plan for you, and that plan is perfect happiness, and all you have to do is just say fiat, say yes. Okay. All right. Last principle. It says, willing and doing all this purely for the glory of God and solely to please Him, and because He so wills and merits thus to be loved and served. All right, somebody help me out. What is glory?
How the good is known. And it's manifestation of one's a king who's really good, like people praise him.
Okay, so you more or less had the definition of known, but it also has to be shown, right? Shown and known. Goodness shown and known is glory. How many of you ever had the experience of just being absolutely overwhelmed by something good that God did to you? Hopefully everybody. Right? Was it anything really big? Like, have you ever had that experience where you're just like, totally 100% know that was God. His hand was right there doing it. And it's usually a tinier thing, right? And that's when His goodness is known by you, right? But glory is when it's shown and known. So St. Thomas says it's goodness that is displayed and manifest in its splendor. Let your light so shine before men that they will see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. How many of you ever had that happen to you? Where you did something good and the person didn't even acknowledge you and gave glory to God. Great, isn't it? Like, isn't that awesome? Right? Isn't that totally awesome when somebody does that? Did you feel slighted at all when that happened? No, right? Because that's what we're made for. That's what we're made for. It's so that we become these vessels that people see right through and see God's goodness. All right, so that was the fifth principle. Questions?